Hi there! In this video we're going to learn how to create a component for an RJ45 double socket. The process is very similar to the creation of an RJ45 simple socket, but it has some differences which I'm going to make note here in this video. So much like any other component, we start by selecting our block and by adding a title. Now we start by adding the articles inside our component. The first article is going to be the article for the double socket itself. So here we go. It's going to show up on the chapter 2.3 of the appliances, and I also need to add the box into which my socket is going to be inserted upon. So I'm going to add an appliances box. Here we go. For chapter 2.1 for tubing. Now, much like the RJ45 simple socket, I now need to take into account two things. The first is that I am working on a telecommunications project, and the second is that I am working on a 2D environment, and as such I have no perception of the height of my component. But I do know that from my project that this socket is around 50 centimeters up from the ground, so I need to take into account the amount of cable and tubing needed to do that climb. And since we are working on a telecommunications project, I also need to take into account the climb from the ground up to the network rack on the other side, on the opposite side of my socket. So to do this, I'm going to add inside the component for my socket the articles for both my cable and my tubing. So first I start by adding my UTP Cat6 cable in chapter 2.2 for the cabling, and since we are now this is a component for a double socket, I'm going to need to have two cables, and to do that I just arrive here, I just go here to the quantity and increase to 2. So what this means is that there will be two articles, in this case two cables, for my component. And now I also need to add the tubing into which these two cables are going to be inserted. So I'm now going to add an isogrease tube with 25 millimeters of diameter to insert both my cables for chapter 2.1 for tubing. Now we also need to note that CAD meter is currently only taking into account 1 meter for both my cables and 1 meter for my tube. Well, I need far more than that. In the case of the tubing, in the case of the cabling first, I'm going to need the 50 centimeters from going up in my socket, but I'm also going to need around 1 meter or so to climb up to my network rack, and even more, even some more meters to do the internal connections inside the network socket. So I'm going to add in my articles for both my cables, I'm going to add a variable called the network socket variable, which is going to multiply by 5 the length of each individual article, which will totalize 10 meters accounted for in this component of cable. Regarding the tube, I won't need 5 meters of tube because the tube doesn't go inside the network rack, and as such I may only need the tube to do the climb from my socket, which is around 50 centimeters, and the climb up to my network rack, which is another 1 meter or so. So I'm going to add 2 meters for my tube. I'm going to manually add 2 meters for my tube. And there you go, we have created, now that our component is correctly configured, I click in save. It has now appeared here, and I also it is wise to make sure if the rest of my project is coherent with what I did. So I'm checking now the cable going inside my socket, and I can check that I do also have here 2 cables and the tube with the correct diameter. So I believe that my project is all correct. So now I'm free to proceed with further budgeting.